Just waiting for Mike. One second.
Entrepreneurial, leadership, intellectual, this is the Cultural Connections Podcast.
And good morning, everybody. My name is Brian Ives, and I am the producer and the host of the Cultural Connections Podcast. Before I introduce our guest today, I want to remind all of our viewers that we are recording this episode live on Wednesday, October 23rd, 2024. And this episode is being live streamed over on YouTube. So if you have questions for our guest during the duration of the podcast today, please feel free to comment them below, and we'll do our best to answer them live. Before I go further, I do want to let our viewers know with these next couple of episodes, several episodes that you'll be seeing of the podcast up until the November election, we're going to be focusing in specifically, as we're being located here in Massachusetts, on the 5 ballot questions. Now, originally, when I had thought this out, I was hoping to do this in a way where we would go in the order of the ballot questions 1 to 5. But then I realized it made more sense to go in the route of whoever gets back to you first and go in their people's schedule instead of trying to do it in that order. So for today, we're going to be focusing in on question 4 on the ballot, starting with that. And question 4, if you are unfamiliar with the question, is a question that is, if passed, would allow persons age 21 and older to grow, possess, and use certain natural psychedelic substances in certain circumstances. A tongue twister. Joining me on the podcast today on the vote no side of this is Dr. Anahita Dua, and she's going to be giving us information on why you should vote no on this podcast. And to also make one other thing known, these episodes that you will be seeing are more to give you general fact information. It's not to give that the podcast is taking a viewpoint on one side or another. We have invited on each of the 5 questions people from both sides to discuss with us, which you'll be seeing from starting today, tomorrow, and Friday. And next week into next week, there'll be different questions with both sides. So stay tuned for that, and we will be having different guests coming on throughout the next several days. But first, I want to let our guest introduce herself and give her a little bit more about your background before we go any bit further.
Thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to be here, and I really appreciate this forum to be able to give some facts about the different sides. My name is Anahita Dua. I am a vascular surgeon over here in Boston. I did my training out in California at Stanford and then moved out here. My specialty area is in vascular disease. As I mentioned, I'm a physician and really committed to the community in this specific area.
That's great. Well, let's get right into it then about this question. I think it's one of the questions on the ballot that I know, at least myself, when I first saw the question. It's a question probably people think, okay, so what exactly does this mean? Let's start off with the basic question of what is a psychedelic drug for our viewers that don't really quite understand the meaning of a psychedelic drug.
Sure, no, it's a fantastic question. So there are different types of psychedelic drugs. And what they really do is they act on receptors in the brain to allow some people to have experiences where they can be in a state of mind where they can receive and feel things that they might not be able to do just naturally. And what I do want to say is, psychedelic drugs were demonized historically, especially because of some of the stuff that happened in the 60s.
Right.
And that is definitely not the approach from the no side. We're not out here to say, hey, this is a war on drugs. It's not at all. In fact, to your question about psychedelic reagents, there are some psychedelic drugs that really, at some point in the future, are going to absolutely be used as medications for certain disease processes in certain patients. But therein lies the point. Certain disease processes for certain patients. And who are these certain patients? And what are these certain diseases? That's really the issue that we're kind of grappling with currently.
Oh, that makes perfect sense. And let me jump into it a little bit further. Is then what what would be, I guess, then the implications of something like this getting passed in the state of Massachusetts if the voters approve this? What would be certain implications that which is as to why you would want voters to vote no on this question?
Well, let's start out talking about the question.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a really important distinction. We're not talking about the question is not, are psychedelics good or bad? The question is not, should psychedelics be studied more? The question specifically asks Massachusetts voters if, two parts. Number one, in our state, should we decriminalize psychedelics and allow for facilities where people would go in order to pay, so it would be a for-profit, pay to
Right.
get psychedelics given to them by facilitators. So these are not doctors, these are facilitators who then ensure that you do it safely and then ensure that you have someone to drive you home. And here's the problem, and the second part, also in Massachusetts, allow for a person to grow a 12 by 12 foot room, 144 square feet of mushrooms in their own home for use. Now, the problem with the question, and this is why the vote no side has come about, is that it is contradictory. On the one hand, we're saying you need to have a licensed facilitator in a facility give this to you safely. On the other hand, we're saying, oh, and also go ahead and grow a 12 by 12 foot room and use it freely. And the contradiction is really the issue. If on the one hand, we're saying you need someone to drive you home after using this,
Right.
but on the other hand, we're saying,
Do what you want on
do
your
what you
own.
want to do.
Right.
That is kind of the issue. And again, this is not about saying psychedelics do not work. I am the first one as a physician who cares about the patients and wants to make sure that people get what they need. I can say clearly the people who are on the yes side, absolutely. There are people on that side that have used psychedelics that have had wonderful experiences and gotten better from whatever pathologies they had, including things like PTSD, depression, anxiety. Absolutely. However, again, it comes back to who are these patients and what specifically worked for them may not work for you. What I want to talk about, when we're talking, you asked me the question about, well, what are the effects? Well, in a person potentially who's a schizophrenic, let's take, for example, who's taking medications that already work on neurotransmitters in the brain. We don't know if they go and take psychedelics in what dose, when, how much, what impact that may have. And there is published data that shows that in some patients, you can cause a psychotic state. In some patients, you can get neurotoxicity, which is toxicity to the neurological system. And in some patients, you can get severe cardiac heart toxicity. Now, all drugs have side effects. Tomorrow, if you come to see me for an infection and I give you antibiotics, it's going to have a label that says, hey, please, Brian, don't take it if you have this.
Right.
All we are saying on the no side is, at this point, based on the data, we simply do not have enough data to write what are the contraindications, what are the risk factors in which populations. So what we don't want is, for example, let's take a woman who is pregnant, okay? Maybe, just make it up, 24 weeks pregnant. Fetal brain development is happening and whatnot. What's the effect on the fetus brain development in that pregnant woman? I don't know. You don't know. I don't know. Nobody knows.
Yep.
What's the effect on somebody who has a heart arrhythmia? Now, because we say like, hey, psychedelics could be good for veterans who may have PTSD. But you know what? A lot of veterans are older
Right.
and on blood thinners and on, medications. People, for example, from the Vietnam War are older now. And what's the impact of taking this drug in conjunction with whatever else they're on? I don't know. And
Yeah.
I don't know is not a great answer from a doctor. The FDA itself just stopped a trial on psychedelics just a couple months ago because of, quote, safety and efficacy concerns. Now,
Mhm.
again, I don't want to say that we will never do it. We absolutely will. Right in the Mass General, in our backyard
Yeah.
here, we are studying psilocybin, which is one of the psychedelic drugs, to see the benefits of it in certain people. And I am almost certain, I would bet my license on it, that coming
Mm.
down the pike someday, we absolutely are going to be prescribing the medication. But
Okay.
right now, to just unleash it on society without knowing the impact and the unintended consequences, I feel personally is dangerous.
No, that, of course, I think that makes a lot of sense. But before I go further, I do want to remind again our viewers here that are just tuning in with us that we are live here on the Cultural Connections podcast on Wednesday, October 23rd, 2024. And we are talking about the ballot questions here. Specifically today, we're focused on question 4. And we're talking about why you should vote no on this particular episode on question 4, which is, again, if passed, would allow persons aged 21 and older to grow, possess, and use certain natural psychedelic substances in certain circumstances. So my next question to you is thinking about it is, and this is something maybe you know the answer, maybe you don't, is looking at this as a nationwide picture.
Hmm.
What other states that have there? How many? So I'm not familiar with this myself. Have enacted similar, passed similar legislation or or had their voters vote on this, and what has been the result of something like this?
That's a fantastic question. And
Mm.
that's a beautiful way for
Yeah.
us to look at it, like what's happened and what's been the impact.
Right.
Well, there are two states currently that have passed laws. Now, I want to be very clear.
Yeah.
These two states have not passed what we are asking on the ballot
Yeah.
question. The two states, specifically Oregon and Colorado,
Mhm.
have passed legislation to allow for these facilities where a person can go and pay upwards of in the thousands of $1,200, $1,400 to go on a trip with psychedelics with a facilitator there. Couple of things. This 12 by 12-foot room where people can just grow it freely is not
Yeah.
part of what people have done. So that, that's a question mark. I don't know
Right.
what the unintended consequence. But talking about the facilities themselves, actually, ironically, what has happened specifically in Oregon, and this is all available, by the way, you can just Google it. In Oregon, what they found is the majority of the people that were coming to use the facilities were actually coming from out of state. So
Mm.
they're getting a out of state influx. Now, is that good or bad or what? It's just a statement. People are coming from out of state, whether that,
Right.
like I mentioned, but may not be something that we would ideally want in our communities. The secondary part of it is, interestingly, you would think that, hey, this is for profit and this is going to make a lot of money, but actually a lot of the Oregon facilities are closing because they're
Mm.
unable to maintain the profit margins
Right.
because they don't have enough of the clientele, or I mean, I'm not a business person, but ultimately it's become a headache. Actually,
Right.
it didn't work as a
Right.
business model. um there's no situation, like I can't tell you like, oh, these many people have been hospitalized, these many, because that data just doesn't exist.
Yeah.
I couldn't tell you. I will say though, in a situation where you'd have a 12 by 12-foot room, you could absolutely make the argument that a black market could come from that.
Right.
That now, look, what are you going to do with all this stuff? On the other hand, you could say right back to me, well, so what? Like, so
Right.
what if you sell mushrooms? And you know what? That's an argument. On the other hand, then comes the question of, well, remember what happened with marijuana, for example.
Right.
Now we have it's you can do it on the street. You can, we have the smell in different places. We have people that are, doing it in different locations. Does it matter? That's a personal decision. You have to
Yeah.
decide whether you think it matters or not. But can it create, and will it create, a black market? I feel personally it will, because again, that's a lot of mushrooms.
Yeah.
The secondary part of it is, obviously, if you're in a home, you have children, you have pets, they could get
Right.
into this stuff. Again, it begs the question, so what happens if a dog eats a bunch of mushrooms? I don't know, but that's again part of the problem. I
Right.
don't know. We need to
Right.
know these things before we
Right.
again allow it on. What is the impact? I have two children, very young, both under the age of 10. I don't know what would happen if I can absolutely see my young son,
Mm,
getting into just maybe not the daughter, but definitely the son. And what would that mean for his developing brain? Again, I
right,
don't know. It could be
right,
nothing, but it could be serious. And if it can be serious, we owe it to ourselves to know. So to your
right,
question, what's been the impact? I don't think it's been studied enough to know, and it's not been around in Colorado and Oregon that long. I
right.
will say though, other states, for example, California, kind of our sister across the
Right.
country. Gavin Newsom vetoed a bill. He's the
Mm,
obviously vetoed a bill saying, "Hey, we should decriminalize." And why? For the same reason I'm telling you right now, because we don't have enough data. Certainly,
right.
California doesn't think oh, drugs are bad. It's more of a, hey, again, like we owe it to ourselves to do this scientifically, not emotionally. Does psilocybin help? It does, but we got to know for which patients when. The other place I know in Maine,
Mm,
the director of the CDC there, a doctor came out and spoke against
mm,
allowing this to happen there too. Same reason, always the same reason. Hey, we need a little bit more data. Let the FDA do their job,
right.
right? Let them figure out the nuances before we unleash something on society.
Absolutely. I know. I think it makes a lot of sense. Then let's take a look back here in the fact of what we do know about psychedelic drugs
Mm-hmm,
and the impact that has brought us to where we are present day today.
mm-hmm.
How, with the information that we know so far, what is it that we still what remains out? What is the remaining question that remains to figure out? Okay, so what are the next steps then from here, and how
That's a
to move
great
forward?
question. So we know global ideas. For example, we know psychedelics seem to help people with PTSD. Okay, let's use this topic specifically. Because what it does is it allows the brain, again, remember I mentioned earlier, to kind of receive information in a different way than it would just naturally.
Mm,
And so it can allow people to sort of uh, develop this neuroplasticity, which means like they can reroute the thinking in their brain such that the traumatic event does not elicit the same response again and again and again as people have when they have PTSD. That's a wonderful thing. I would never want to get in the way of something like that. That's
right, right,
wonderful. I'm at the front lines of yes. However, what now when you go to the next step? Okay, yes, it seems to work for some people. You go to the next step. Well, who are those people? That's where we don't know. And when I say
right,
who are those people, what I mean is what circumstances do they need to be in order for it to work? What is the dose of the drug and for how long and when for it to be durable? And most importantly, and here's this is the scientist in me talking now. What we don't have is a phase 3 trial. So what's a phase 3 trial? Phase 3 trial, right? And trials come in different phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Phase 3 trial is when you check to make sure that something that you think works actually works. What do I mean by that? Let's say you come to me and you have a cough, okay? And I say, you know what, Brian? I want you to go to the sauna every day for the next 5 days and take in the steam, and your
right,
cough will go away at the end of it. And you go and you do it, okay? And then you come back to me in 5 days and you're like, hey, it worked. I want to pass a bill that says everybody who has a cough goes to the
right,
sauna for 5 days and Medicare covers it.
right,
You could get really riled up about it. You could get really enthused. But you know what? If someone has a cough from smoking or from COVID or from cancer, they need different things. And actually, for some people, it may not work at all. For some people, it may hurt them to walk into a steam sauna.
right,
And so, what I need to do then is a study where I take, a certain number of Brians, let's say, 500 people, and we do a power analysis to figure out how many patients we would take in. And we give half of them the steam sauna and half of them what we just do regularly, what we call standard of care. And then we compare at the end and say, does this work? Does this not work? Does this hurt?
mm,
And that's how we decide what drugs and for who and when. And that's how we've been doing it forever. That's the way. That's the scientific method.
yeah,
And we have not done that
yeah,
for this. You can't just say anxiety, PTSD, depression, and just lump it. These are very different things. And again, what I mentioned earlier to you, maybe psychedelics really work for somebody, okay?
mm,
But if that person happens to be on a medication for psychosis, now maybe there might be a negative interaction. Or maybe
right,
that person needs to be in a particular state of mind that's different from just the average person.
Yeah.
And that is really important. There's been reports, for example, marijuana, for example, right? Again, not saying anything against marijuana, works beautifully for pain. Well
Right.
established. Study's been done. But I just recently saw actually an article that pregnant women who smoke marijuana can have the risk of fetuses being born with low birth rate.
Yeah.
And if I'm a pregnant woman living in Massachusetts and the government is telling me, the law is telling me, it's okay, go ahead, you can go ahead. I want to make sure that I'm not doing anything without informed consent. And
Right.
what is informed consent? It means you are responsible for informing me, the government, the society, the doctors,
Right.
responsible for informing me what is safe. And if you're saying, okay, it's good enough, then fine, I'm going to go do it. But I don't need to find out, so to speak, 10 years from now. And
Right.
so, in order to inform our public, to allow them to then make decisions about their bodies, we need to have the data to give to them, and we
Right.
don't. And I
Right.
think that's so people will sometimes say to me, well, what about alcohol? Alcohol is legal. Why are you? Well, the answer to that is we know the effects of alcohol. It's been studied like crazy. So when you walk into a store as a pregnant woman drinking alcohol, you know what what decision you're making. You
Mm.
can't, now you choose to do it, and whether the government should be involved in the decision making of people putting stuff in their bodies, that's a totally different argument. And I'm
Right.
actually on the side of course not. People
Right.
should have complete control over their bodies, but they should also have, in order to have control, you need to know what you're doing.
Mm.
And that's where I think we, at this point, are too early to just let this out into society.
Absolutely. No, I hear what you're saying. It makes totally sense. Again, before we go further, I do want to just remind our viewers at home that this is the Cultural Connections podcast. We're recording live on Wednesday, October 23rd, 2024. And we are talking about one of the 5 ballot questions here in Massachusetts this November, coming up in less than 2 weeks from now. And that question is question number 4. And that is, if passed, it would allow persons aged 21 and older to grow, possess, and use certain natural psychedelic substances in certain circumstances. If you have questions about, and we are specific about why you should vote no. If you have questions about this and would like them answered, and you're watching us live here on YouTube, please feel free to comment below, and we'll do our best to get the question answered live. My next question then to you then is thinking about this as we now move down the line once it and in the future, let's say moving along the lines here. Would this make more sense then, along the lines, in your opinion, for it to be a state by state thing of pass? I mean, eventually down the road, passing laws like this that would go into effect, or would it make more sense or would you see this as something that would eventually hit the national spotlight and go into a national picture? And if so, which do you think is the better approach down the road?
We are the United States of America. This
Yeah,
is my personal opinion. I believe that if something is good, appropriate, safe, and helps people, every single citizen of this country and not citizen and anybody who lives here, everyone in the
yeah,
world should have the right to it. So what I see, what would be the kind of the wonderful thing is we study this drug, right? We figure out who it's good for. And believe me, it's going to be good for certain people. And then on a national level, we do absolutely decriminalize it
mhm,
so that people who need it can get it. And you know what? I don't really have a personal thing about the recreational aspect of it. Like
but
that's not like it's not like, oh, it should only be, but there have to be, again, the informed consent aspect of it. So people need to know what effect it can have on them, like alcohol, right?
yeah,
Exactly the same kind of thing. So, but I do feel that if it's something that helps people, that it should be something that's available to everyone. But I think we kill our chances of that,
yeah,
murder them, frankly, by
right,
doing this wrong the first time. This needs to be, we're going to get one shot. Do it right, do it once.
right,
Get the data, make the argument. We are Massachusetts. Massachusetts is like, I mean, we lead in our like gun control laws, our approach to healthcare, our ability, our schooling, I mean, we are top notch. And I feel like this is an area where, you know what, if we really believe in this, then let's invest
yeah,
financially in studies in Massachusetts, get the data, make a good argument, and then go out onto the national stage and try to get this so that everybody, even in the middle of Arkansas, can have it if it helps them through XYZ. But I
absolutely,
feel like by sort of, jumping the gun, and,
right,
unfortunately, if unintended consequences then come from that, and it
Right.
once again goes into people's psyche as this thing that should be demonized, I think we lose our opportunity. That's my opinion.
No, I think it makes a lot of sense in what you're saying. Um, then let's look at it in the fact of I'm curious to understand here. You mentioned earlier in the podcast about Colorado and Oregon
Hmm.
that have passed different, similar but yet different laws that allow people access to these psychedelic drugs. What would be do you think what they passed is the right approach, or do you think that is also still not the right approach? And if so, why?
Oh no, I globally believe that all of this has been too premature.
Yeah,
I think the if this is a drug that helps people that should be given out. I mean, because the argument has been like this is something medicinal, this can help people get through things that they need to get through. I think the idea of making it for profit in centers that
right.
only certain people have access to is a travesty, frankly. I'm a doctor. I recognize I work in the United States healthcare system, but if we're saying that this is something that's good for vets and good for who's got $700 to $1,000 for one trip to go and drop in. I mean, that's why Oregon is not getting customers, right? Ultimately, that's why they're shutting down because who can afford that? And then the question becomes, well, how many times do you need to do this? Like, is this something that you do 4 times and you're done? Is it something that you need to kind of every year go and get a touch up? Like, again, nobody knows. Nobody knows. And so I feel like all of them across the board have sort of jumped the gun because the fundamental basic point is we don't have enough data to be doing this right yet. And instead of
Right.
going and opening these for-profit centers and spending all this money on trying to push something through that's a little half-baked, why not, again, my opinion, shunt that money towards research funding,
Right.
ask the right questions, get their answers, and then you know what? Psychedelics aren't going anywhere. They're going to be here
Right.
on ballot, in 2028 and 2030 and 20.
Right.
Let's do it right and get it on the ballot in an intelligent way when we're ready to do that. And
Yeah.
I don't think, I mean, I've had a lot of conversations about this, and everyone sort of teeters on yeah, we don't have all the data,
Yeah.
and kind of the logistics and some of the laws are what are kind of making people feel, but let's just get this through and then we'll work out the details later. That has never worked as a
Right.
way to get something through. I'm not saying that we have to get every single,
Check.
I dotted and T crossed, but I think not even knowing which patients when, that's a fairly basic thing we should know before we.
No, absolutely. No, I agree. And as we start to, believe it or not, a half hour to 40 minutes goes by like that in an instant, I always say with these podcasts. I'd like to
Mm.
give you the final chance here to, again, just to explain the importance from your side of why voters here in Massachusetts, obviously, where we're broadcasting from, should be voting no on this question coming up in less than 2 weeks from now.
Honestly, at this point, a no vote is a safe vote because right now, the way that the ballot question is written, it is completely contradictory. On the one hand, it says that there are going to be medical facilities, which, by the way, will not have medical professionals in them, but
Hmm.
they are facilities that people can go to pay in order to go through trips, and they need to have a safety net associated with that. But in the same ballot question, we also say a person can grow in their own home a 12 by
Right.
12-foot room, which is massive, and allow them access freely. That might lead to a black market and, of course, the dangers of pets or kids getting into this sort of thing. But the real issue, the crux of the issue, and why one should vote no is that we are just too early. We do not know. And I'm
Hmm.
not trying to fear monger here. We just don't know. We just don't know which patients, how much of the drug, how long, and what diseases. We don't know what interactions these particular psychedelics have with common medications that people take currently, including things like antibiotics, blood thinners, insulin. We don't know. We don't know. We don't know. And
Right.
we do know, what we do know, a little bit of negative effect, is we do know that these drugs do have an effect, negative, toxic effect on the heart in certain doses and a toxic effect on the neurology in some patients, in some cases, not everybody, in some. But we
Right.
really need to tease that out before we can just unleash something on the population. We have no idea what the effect this has on a developing child's brain. We cannot allow people to feel like they're safe doing something without us properly giving them the data. The FDA just rejected a trial because of safety and efficacy concerns, not because the drugs may not work, but because we don't have enough data to, again, know who they work in and when.
Mhm.
So I would advise Massachusetts, we are a beacon for many things that protect society and,
Yeah.
that's liberal and pushes things forward. And we will be a beacon for this as well, but we need to invest in the science and the data. And then once we have that, then move
Mhm.
forward and feel free to decriminalize as long as we can then figure out who is going to actually benefit. But before we do that, right now, we're running on emotion. And when
Right.
you're doing something that's emotional without thinking it through, that can have very severe unintended consequences, up to and including potentially, even if this were to get passed, it being taken out of society if there are unintended consequences, and then it will never come back. So
Right.
let's do it once and let's do it right. Let's invest in research, which we're already doing, by the way, in Massachusetts, get those answers, and then in the future, write a more intelligent ballot question that potentially could get passed.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And what I'll ask here finally, then to you is then, is that for people that want to get more information on this ballot question, where would you suggest that they go online to look for more information about this? If they want to learn about voting, specifically no, in this case here, where would they find more information?
Sure. No, that's a fantastic question. Honestly, I think the best thing to do at this point, given that we're so close, to kind of get consolidation of all the data,
Yeah.
actually, if you look at, for example, the
Yeah.
Boston Globe just published, just a couple of weeks ago, maybe, an article where they kind of listened to both sides and they
Yeah.
decided to not endorse so basically they're siding with saying no.
Yeah.
And they've written a beautiful article. It's actually a, very logical statement about kind of why we are where we are right now. And I would advise readers and viewers to go and take a read of some of the consolidated literature about this topic that tells you the pros and cons and tells you why it is that voting no is the right move.
Yeah.
And I think starting with that Boston Globe article is probably the best first step.
Absolutely. And we will find that for those interested in reading that Boston Globe article. I will put a link to we'll find the article and put a link to the article here in the description of all of the platforms so you can access the podcast from. Well, this has again been quite interesting, quite knowledgeable. It's always great to learn about these ballot questions. I think especially for hopefully for our viewers who find this information again useful. Again, as a reminder, as I said at the very beginning of this podcast, that these episodes that you're going to be seeing moving forward from today moving forward for the next week or so are about the ballot questions here on the Cultural Connections podcast. I'm not taking sides on it. It is more to get you, our viewers, the information on exactly what is these in the facts, so you understand what these ballot questions mean. So we're hoping to get. We have reached out to all of the representatives from both sides of each of the 5 questions. If you stay tuned with us tomorrow on the podcast around this time tomorrow at 11 a.m. tomorrow, which is we are going to be actually having the yes side of question 4 coming on to join us to say why you should vote yes. On Friday, we'll be joined by representatives from question 5. Monday as well, we'll be focused on question 5, and also sometime next week, we'll be then focusing in on question 2, as we are waiting just to get confirmation on dates and time. So thank you again to Dr. Dua for joining me today. If you have questions or comments or suggestions about future episodes of the podcast, please feel free to reach out to me via email at brianives@gmail.com. That's BRIANIV as in Victor, ES @gmail.com. And we hope that you find these episodes coming up useful. And thank you again to everyone at home for watching. And we'll see you again next time on the Cultural Connections podcast. I'm Brian Ives, and I'm the producer and the host of the Cultural Connections podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you again for watching this episode of the Cultural Connections podcast. For more information on today's episode, be sure to check out our social media pages on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can also watch this episode again in its entirety on our YouTube channel. This podcast is also available on listening platforms Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Pocket Casts, Breaker, Radio Public, and New TV. Thanks again for watching.